collision between the tanker Mercedes Belle and the car ferry Maranhão is fictional, its causes are common to many real events. All too often, a pilot is involved, but the fault is not necessarily that of the pilot alone. As before in this series of presentations, we'll be asking three key questions. What happened? Why did it happen? And how can we prevent such incidents happening to our own vessels? Let's look at what happened. The Mercedes Belle was inbound to an oil terminal in the late afternoon. The pilot boarded her and discussed the passage plan with the master, who then gave him the con for the harbour entry. At the time, the car ferry Maranhão was outbound. She was running late. The ferry's master gave the con to the second officer. The weather was calm, but patches of fog reduced visibility. Breakwaters narrowed the entrance of the bay, outside of which were scattered fishing boats. As was usual practice on this ferry, the master left the bridge shortly after sailing, leaving the officer of the watch and the helmsman. The ferry's second officer altered course to pass through the gap between the breakwaters. This manoeuvre brought the ferry close to an outbound container ship. The second officer altered course to keep clear after being asked to do so. When the pilot on the tanker saw the ferry through the breakwater, he radioed the ferry to agree how they would pass. The pilot agreed with the manoeuvre to pass green to green because it would keep the tanker clear of the fishing boats. But he did not inform the master. Shortly afterwards, a car deck fire alarm went off. The second officer sent the helmsman to investigate, put the vessel on autopilot, and concentrated on the fire alarm panel. As the two vessels closed, the tanker master became concerned. But the pilot knew the master of the ferry and his practices. He was confident the ferry would turn in time, unaware that the master was not on the bridge and that the ship was on autopilot. On the ferry, the second officer was faced with several distractions and did not monitor the radar or the vessel's position relative to the tanker. The tanker master's concern increased as time passed, but the pilot remained confident that the ferry would turn to port. At nearly the same moment, the tanker master and the second officer on the ferry realized the imminent danger. The ferry's second officer first, and then the tanker master, took avoiding action. Both turned to starboard, maneuvers that might have avoided collision. But before the wheel was put to starboard on the tanker, the ferry's second officer brought the wheel back to port when he was reminded by the pilot, in Korean, that they'd agreed to pass starboard to starboard. Why did it happen? Such incidents are usually due to an escalation of individual elements and decisions that, when combined, make the final incident inevitable. Both vessels were in good mechanical order, with modern navigational aids. The fire alarm on the Maranhão did sound a false alarm. This is not unusual on this type of vessel, but it did distract the second officer from his responsibility for safe navigation. Let's look at the human factors. First, the ferry. It was an easy, undemanding passage, and over time the ferry officers had become complacent. Once they left port, they took things easy. The master of the ferry handed over the con to the second officer and left the bridge when the ferry was outbound in conditions of variable visibility, with the presence of two other large vessels and a number of fishing boats. He did not fully brief the second officer about weather, traffic, or even that he'd put the engine telegraph to full ahead. He told the second officer to make up for lost time and to get ahead of the outbound container ship, which put pressure on that officer and thereby influenced several critical decisions later. The second officer. When the second officer set a course for the gap in the breakwaters and turned inside the container ship, he passed too close to it. Close enough to cause the master of the container ship some concern. The incident added to the psychological pressure on the second officer. Once through the breakwater, he wanted to go south as soon as possible to save time. During the conversation with the pilot, the second officer was concerned about the fishing boats, which further distracted him from his situational awareness. When the fire alarm went off, he sent the helmsman to investigate, but did not give attention to the navigation of the vessel. At no time did he look out of the bridge windows before he attended to some paperwork that could have waited. Even when the fire alarm situation was resolved, he attended to the ECDIS waypoint alarm before checking the ship's situation. Only when he finally looked up did he realize that the vessel was in danger. He forgot the arrangements made earlier with the pilot about passing green to green and gave the wheel order to turn to starboard. Only after giving the wheel order did he realize that the helmsman was not on the bridge, losing precious seconds while he went to the wheel. In fact, the turn to starboard would have been the correct procedure, but for the arrangement with the pilot. However, in response to the pilot's alert, he changed his mind and turned to port, in the belief that the tanker would also turn to port. When he saw the tanker begin its turn to starboard, he realized it was too late to do anything to avoid contact. Now let's look at the tanker. The pilot. The pilot was fully briefed by the tanker master and was fully confident in his own abilities to navigate the vessel safely. When he agreed green to green passing, he spoke in Korean, a language not understood by any other member of the tanker bridge team, and did not inform the master that they were to pass starboard to starboard, so no one else on the bridge was aware of the arrangements. The pilot wrongly assumed that the master, whose habits he knew, was in command of the ferry. This assumption seemed to be confirmed by the turn close to the container ship. He continued to operate on that assumption when, in reality, there was no one on the ferry bridge paying attention. When he realized that the ferry was going to starboard, he insisted on her turning to port, again speaking in Korean, so that the master of the tanker, unaware of the pilot's call for the ferry to turn to port, turned the tanker to starboard across the ferry's new track. The tanker master. Because the conversation between the pilot and the ferry was in Korean, a language the master did not understand, he did not know what special arrangements for passing had been made, nor did he clarify the pilot's intentions. When he took over from the pilot, he did not know that the pilot had told the ferry to go to port as agreed. Unknown to the tanker master, the pilot's instructions to the ferry turned a possibly savable situation into an inevitable disaster. How could the incident have been avoided? Let's start with the ferry. The ferry master should have briefed the second officer more fully before giving him the con. He could have waited until after the ferry had passed through the breakwaters and the fishing boats before handing over to him. The second officer became engrossed in his immediate tasks of keeping clear of the container ship, lining up for the breakwater, and getting through the fishing boats, but did not pay attention to the proximity of the tanker and that it was closing rapidly. When the fire alarm sounded, he should have assigned someone other than the helmsman to check it out instead of taking on the helmsman's duties. The second officer then became focused on resetting the fire alarm, when he should have concentrated on the safe navigation of the vessel. As he was about to check the vessel's position, he allowed himself to be distracted by paperwork. He should have checked the ship's situation first. After the fire alert was resolved, the second officer was again distracted by the ECDIS waypoint alarm. In fact, the second officer prioritized the ship's systems and instruments, not safe navigation. It was only at the last moment that he even looked up. If he had at any time just looked out of the window, he would have seen the tanker and could have taken avoiding action early enough to avoid the collision. Systems and instruments do not guarantee safe navigation. Now, the tanker. The pilot communicated with the ferry in Korean. He should also have communicated the information to the master in English to ensure that the master was fully aware of his intentions. The pilot wrongly assumed that the ferry was under the command of its master and was overconfident that he knew how the ferry would maneuver. The pilot did not react until he saw the ferry turning to starboard. At that point, the tanker was not turning, and he had the option of ordering a turn to starboard. Instead, he insisted that the ferry turn to port, a critical decision that guaranteed a collision. The tanker master rightly had full confidence in the pilot at the outset, but he should have clarified the pilot's intentions, which would have enhanced his situational awareness. He would have known of the green-to-green arrangement and been in a position to act accordingly. He grew increasingly concerned as the two vessels approached each other, but limited himself to muttered comments rather than asking questions that might have resulted in action. Influenced by the pilot's confidence, the master reacted too late. By then, neither on the tanker bridge nor the ferry bridge did anyone have a true picture of what was going on. If the tanker master had made one short blast on the ship's whistle when he eventually altered to starboard, the ferry's second officer would have known not to turn back to port, and the collision might have been avoided. So what lessons can we learn? Always bear in mind one key principle. The master, or his representative on the bridge, always is responsible for the safe navigation of the vessel, even when a pilot is on board. 1. Keep a good lookout. 2. Follow the rules of the road. Use them and you won't go wrong. 3. Alter course or speed early and in such a way as to make it clear to other vessels that you have done so. Use sound signals. 4. When a pilot is on board, clarify his intentions, monitor his communications, and if in doubt, ask. 5. When you feel something is wrong, say something, do something. 6. Do not make assumptions about what another vessel might or might not do. 7. Ensure that the incoming officer of the watch is properly briefed. 8. Do not become focused on instruments and systems to the exclusion of other sources of information, particularly visual. 9. Look out of the window. Before every maneuver and at frequent intervals, check that everything looks right. The Mark I eyeball still is the best instrument you have to keep you safe. The pilot is the stranger on the bridge. As with any stranger, don't take him for granted.